All right, welcome to the SNRE graduate seminar. Today we have Jessica Hightower that will be presenting. And welcome if you're joining us on YouTube as well. It looks like we have 12 people joining us on YouTube. One announcement before we get started. The November 23rd seminar has been canceled. So if you are keeping track, go ahead and mark that one off of your calendar. So today we have Dr. Rob Fletcher to introduce Jessica. Go ahead, Dr. Fletcher.
Great. So it's my pleasure to introduce Jessica Hightower, who has been working in my lab now for several years and is finishing her PhD. So Jess got her bachelor's degree at the University of Central Arkansas and then did her master's at the University of Central Florida. And I guess it was in 2015, I was really interested in trying to recruit a student to continue with some work in Borneo. And this is an amazing place, but it's not the easiest place to work. And so when Jess contacted me, I was incredibly impressed because she had done a lot of traveling across the world. She had done a lot of field work, and she seemed like a perfect fit to go to Borneo. And so I was really excited when I was able to recruit her to come. And over the past several years, she has just done an incredible job in this system. And she's going to talk about it today, but a couple of key things that I think are really notable. The first is that Jess is one of the most curious students I've had in my lab. And this makes it a lot of fun to talk science and to hear her thoughts. And she has a really wide diversity of insights and perspective on science and ecology and conservation. And so she's been a real asset to the lab. But also the thing that's really important to bring up is in regards to this work she's going to be talking about today, I basically said, go to Borneo, see what happens. And she did a phenomenal job. So I went and visited her, I guess now several years ago, and it was incredible. This is a place that huge elevational gradients. The vegetation can be really tough to work in. There's leeches everywhere. I feel like every time I go there, I get attacked by leeches. And yet the biodiversity is outstanding and the problems for conservation are huge. And when I went and visited Jess there, she woke me up at 3 in the morning. I was the time change was horrendous. And she got me out and she made me carry mist net poles across this mountainous terrain. And she just was collecting the most interesting data that she's going to talk about today. So she had real resilience and just real amazing with logistics and implementation in the field. And you couple that with curiosity, and what you have is a wonderful dissertation. And so I'm really excited for Jess to finish up this work, and I'm excited to hear what she has to say today. It's all you, Jess.
Thank you, Rob, for that introduction. That was a very nice introduction. I feel very privileged to have worked with the Fletcher Lab over these years and at UF. If you had told undergrad me that I was going to be working in Borneo and at the University of Florida, I would have laughed at you. But it's been a great few years, and I'm excited to share the work that I've been doing. These are highlights from my dissertation, and I hope you enjoy it. So I'm going to be talking about birds logging and oil palm plantations, the response of bird communities to land use in Borneo. Now, so we all know that the world is losing biodiversity at really unprecedented rates. The Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services just released a report in 2019, which in summary said there's overwhelming evidence that 1 million species of animals and plants are threatened with extinction, and that's predicted to occur in the next 50 years. So it's a very critical time in biodiversity and biological conservation work. Now, we know that biodiversity losses can be attributed to a number of different causes, but the primary driver of biodiversity loss is habitat destruction. And what happens here is we have habitat that is not only lost, but the remaining habitat is degraded and fragmented. Now, this is very widespread. If you see in this map by Henson et al., it's a neat online interactive map that you can access. It shows the true extent of forest loss just from 2000 and 2019. So really in the last 2 decades, you can see areas of forest loss in red. Deforestation has been especially prevalent in the tropics. And the concern about this is the tropics are biodiversity hotspots that contain a disproportionate amount of biodiversity. Yet these are often the areas where we see the most loss. Southeast Asia, in particular, especially Borneo, has been the target of accelerated deforestation in the past several decades, and it shows up on this global map as pretty much the. Now, throughout Southeast Asia, and this is including Borneo, which I'm showing on the map here, the primary land use that has been driving this deforestation has been related to silviculture, so logging and tree plantations, and then agriculture. And the big agricultural use in the last few decades has been through an explosion of oil palm production that's throughout the area. And oil palm, it's from Africa, but it's taken place as an energy fuel crop, oil crop throughout Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Africa. Now, with this habitat destruction has come a subsequent loss of diversity, and the loss of habitat has been accompanied by that change in land cover. And so species have been forced to either adapt or to die out, to go locally extinct. So some of those species of concern, this is an Asian elephant up here, an orangutan, where their habitat in Borneo is being severely decreased right now. Now, my dissertation research has focused on understanding the consequences of this habitat loss and the subsequent land use change. Now, the first part of my dissertation is focused on investigating patterns of this community change, looking at how community changes in response to land use change. Second part is focused on developing a method to integrate data sets to improve our estimates of species detection, which can then overall help us understand how species distributions are changing with land use. And then the third and final part of my dissertation is focused on understanding some of these underlying drivers of community change in response to land use, specifically focusing on how diet traits can be used to predict community change. So I'm going to go over the highlights here and take you through it. And I have to bring up birds. To address these questions, I'm using birds as my study taxa, so the bird community in Borneo. And birds are ideal for addressing these questions for a number of reasons. It's not just because I really like birds, they're very pretty, but birds are relatively easy to study in comparison to many other taxa. And I always remember, as Rachel Carson pretty evocatively framed it in her book, Silent Spring, how birds are, you know, a canary in a coal mine. If something is wrong with birds, then it's likely wrong with the rest of the environment. And then finally, birds are critical. The birds perform critical ecosystem functions and are essential at multiple levels. So they provide services from pollination to dispersal and to pest control. And then finally, birds are just pretty amazing. So it does make them a good study group. Now, my study site was located in northern Borneo, in Malaysian Borneo in the state of Sabah, and at the Stability of Altered Forest Ecosystems project site. Now, SAFE was designed to be a landscape scale experiment to test the effects of forest fragmentation, to where in that gray portion of the map, you have the experimental area with the experimental forest fragments, and then surrounded by it, those are oil palm plantations. To just give you a kind of a depiction of what this would look like when it's finally complete. You have these different size hectares that are surrounded by oil palm. Now, SAFE was a part of a logging concession in Borneo that was gazetted for conversion into oil palm by the government, but some of the forest was set aside for experimental forest fragments. The SAFE landscape itself has been, it's a selectively logged landscape, so it's been around those experimental forest fragments has been pretty much salvage logged or clear cut. So they've removed all valuable timber. And then around this SAFE landscape are adjacent oil palm plantations. So for the first part, my dissertation research is, well, for all of my dissertation research, it's taken place within the context of this landscape. Now, my first broad objective was to assess the impact of land use on bird diversity in Borneo. And I wanted to know how the community composition changed with land use and how species diversity, both at the local level and the change in diversity, so the beta diversity, changed in response to land cover change or land use change. To get at that, you kind of have to understand how we measure diversity. So as part of understanding how the bird communities are changing, I wanted to understand the primary drivers of this change. And so to do that, I unpackaged the species diversity. So oftentimes when we're going out and we're measuring diversity, we look at alpha diversity. So we sample in a location and that's our local diversity. We also have gamma diversity, which is the regional diversity. So it's basically the sum of all that diversity for that region. And then we have beta diversity, which gives us an idea of the variation of diversity. And beta diversity can be partitioned into two different parts. We can have turnover versus nestedness. Now, I've got this diagram on the side here that kind of shows what happens when you have a community that's changing due to turnover. With turnover, you get species replacements. So you might have the same number of species in a community, but you're losing some of those species identities are changing. So you're losing some of those species, but they're being replaced by other species. As opposed to nestedness. Nestedness, up here at the top, you start out with a lot of different species and then maybe go and sample another site and it has less species. Now, nestedness is due to species loss. So these are the different partitions of or components of beta diversity. And when we look at this, we can start seeing how to answer this question by determining if community changes are due to nestedness, where species are simply being lost, or if they're due to turnover, where species are changing into novel communities, where new species are being added. So just kind of give you an idea of how this works in a landscape context. This is tropical forest, or this is Costa Rica. So you have Costa Rica, tropical farmlands, where you have forest fragments in the distant, and an agricultural matrix here. And then you have just tropical forest in Costa Rica. Now, the responses of beta diversity to land use change can be rather idiosyncratic. So you can get beta diversity, which is increasing with land use change. So this landscape on the left can have higher beta diversity than the landscape on the right, which seems strange when I say that, like increased land use, higher diversity. But when you delve into that a little bit, you can understand how the different components are going to contribute to that change in diversity. Let's see. So if we understand how these different components underlying that change, we can start to interpret some of the processes that are occurring. For example, in that landscape that has a high beta diversity, the agricultural landscape, that high beta diversity might be due to turnover, where the communities in those little forest plots might have very different communities than the communities in the agricultural areas. So that variation in species diversity is high, and that's due to turnover, so you have species replacement. Another example, beta diversity in fragments could be explained by nestedness. In a fragmented landscape where you have an isolated fragment, you could have species loss due to the isolation of the fragment and this dispersal limitation of those species. So you have a fragment out there that looks similar to the forest, but it's not able to support as many species, or species aren't able to reach it. So you don't have that migration happening. So the landscape context and the patterns of diversity can provide really important insight into what's going on. So I considered this in my safe landscape with the adjacent oil palm. And I looked at 4 different land use categories. I had two landscapes. I had a logged landscape and I had an oil palm landscape. Now, in my logged landscape, I had selectively logged forest fragments that were embedded within a salvage logged matrix. So these small forest fragments that were just surrounded by a salvage logged forest. And then in contrast, the salvage logged forest had a lot of remnant trees, really dense secondary vegetation, elephant grass, and there's no continuous canopy in salvage logged forest. Now in the oil palm landscape, we had the same selectively logged forest fragments, but this time they're embedded within oil palm plantations. So instead of being surrounded by that salvage logged habitat, it's just surrounded by a monoculture of oil palm. And then the fourth and last one, so surrounding that forest fragment is just an oil palm plantation, which has a dense ground cover. And this kind of gives you an example of what those habitats look like in the pictures. If you compare in both of the landscapes, the selectively logged fragments, they look fairly similar. And then if you look at the salvage logged, much denser vegetation, no great canopy cover. And then the oil palm, it's just palm trees. But you don't have to take my word for it. They are different. And I did measure these using different vegetation measurements where I looked, compared canopy cover across all these land use categories and found that if you look over here, I don't know, you probably can't see my cursor. Whoop, you can now. So this in self, so the selectively logged forest and the oil palm forest fragments, those are also selectively logged. So it has much higher canopy cover compared to the salvage logged forest, which has a lower canopy cover, but a lot more variation there. And then compared to the oil palm, the cover there is just oil palm. You see similar patterns with the density of ground vegetation where the selectively logged forests had lower, so that's that dark blue and the dark yellow or the light yellow, you have much dense or not as dense ground cover, which is what you typically see in these tropical forests. The ground cover might not be as dense, but as soon as you go out into that salvage log landscape, much denser, a lot more variation in the ground cover density. And then in oil palm, it is a denser ground cover, and that's primarily contributed to the legumes. They plant a legume cover crop in oil palm. So each of those sites, I used mist netting to sample the community, and I had 100-meter mist net transects per site. The sites were sampled for 2 consecutive days, and each site was sampled for 3 times between March 2018 and June 2019. And this is during the breeding season, which in Borneo, admittedly spans quite a while, between like February and August. And we caught a lot of birds, a lot of really great birds in those mist nets. We had around 4,600 net hours, 2,200 captures, and around 85 species, including like this jewel of a bird with this rufous-collared kingfisher here. So we had a good number of birds. We were able to use that data to look at some of these patterns of diversity in these land use categories. So what did we find? So we found, unsurprisingly, that selectively logged forests, so the logged landscapes, which is this blue over here, these blue lines, had the highest number of species, so highest species richness. While oil palm plantations, both the selectively logged forest fragments in oil palm and the oil palm itself had much lower species richness, and also birds. They just didn't have as many birds. Similar pattern for species diversity. This is just our local species diversity, which showed that logged forests are supporting a more diverse bird community than oil palm landscapes. And finally, we see that in terms of community composition, this is just an ordination analysis with NMDS. We found that community composition did differ by land use. So in this plot, it's just an ordination space. Each point on this plot represents the species community at each site. And you can see here that each of these, we have 4 different land use categories. Each of them are very distinct groups, non-overlapping groups. You see this dark blue is the selectively logged forest, and then the light blue is the salvage logged forest. And then near the other blue groups, we have the selectively logged forest fragments that are embedded within oil palm. So they're all near each other, but they are distinct. And then way over here, we have those oil palm sites, which have communities that are very dissimilar to the other sites. So we have information on this community composition pattern, and we can take that a step further and look into the patterns of beta diversity in this landscape. So I looked at patterns of beta diversity and partitioned them into components, the separate components of turnover and nestedness, to kind of try to understand what's driving some of these patterns. In the logged landscape, so that blue landscape, we see that we have these distinct communities. They are non-overlapping in those blues, and that's largely driven by turnover. But in the oil palm long fragments, you see that overlapping yellow group. It is not very distinct from those other logged groups. So we would interpret that as not being distinct from those logged groups due to turnover. However, if we look over at the oil palm sites, so this brown category way over there on the right, it's very distinct and far from our logged forest categories. So we can interpret that as the dissimilarity in communities being largely driven by turnover and oil palm. So interestingly, we found that the forest fragments and oil palm plantations, so this yellow group, if you look at this plot over here on the right, were largely different due to nestedness. So that is the species communities that were found in these oil palm forest fragments were a subset of these larger communities that were found in the log forest. So we lose a lot of species in the oil palm fragments, where in the oil palm plantation, we're just replacing that species. So that's kind of abstract to think about in terms of community dissimilarity. So the next part is, what do those communities actually look like? And this is probably the slide with the most birds on it. So if we look over here in the selectively logged forest, we have a lot of species here. This is our highest species richness. And this is where we have a lot of those rare forest specialists like trogons and broadbills and pittas. If we look over here in the salvage logged forest, if you remember, there was a bit of turnover that was driving that community dissimilarity in the salvage logged forest. Now we see we're losing some of those rare forest specialists, but we're actually gaining some open habitat generalists. So this dissimilarity is being driven by that turnover species replacement. So you get a lot of the same forest babblers, like this, the fluffy backed tit babbler down at the bottom, and then up at the top, there's a chestnut wing babbler and the little spider hunters all over. But then if you go over to the oil palm landscape and look at the oil palm forest fragment, you see you still have species that you would see in that logged forest, but much fewer. And this is what we would expect for the community dissimilarity being driven by species loss. So that nestedness component. So we still see those forest specialists, like down at the bottom is a black-naped monarch, and then these two different babbler species, but you don't see as many of those forest species as you do in the other logged landscape. And then you get into the oil palm and you don't have any of those forest specialists. What you have left are more open habitat birds and these just generalist species that do really well in really poor disturbed habitat. So here you have yellow-vented bulbuls, which are everywhere. And then above that is a bold-striped tit babbler, and then a tailor bird, and then a pied fantail. So these are species that you see in poor habitat. And honestly, like that's about it for those species. There are more species found in oil palm, but these comprise the majority of those communities. So that's kind of what those land use categories look. And you can see how just looking at the species richness, we might not notice that those differences in the community. So in summary, for that part, species diversity varied by land use. Logged landscapes had more birds and more species. We saw that community composition varied by land use, and that community dissimilarity was driven by turnover in the logged landscape and in the oil palm plantations, but community dissimilarity was driven by nestedness in oil palm forest fragments, so that species lost. So in conclusion, for this part, logging and oil palm plantations do have major impacts on bird community composition. And by actually partitioning the different components of beta diversity, we can use it to gain more insight into these drivers of community change in response to land use. So moving on to the second part of this dissertation is where I focused on how to integrate data in a multi-species occupancy model to optimize the probability of species detection. Now, when we're surveying communities, biologists often use multiple different survey techniques. And each survey generally will capture a portion of the community, but it might not fully capture the entire community. So the biases that are associated with each sampling technique or survey technique and the habitat type may lead to issues with estimates of detectability. So you might detect certain species using one survey technique and not the other, and vice versa. For example, here, mistnets are generally good at capturing species that are at the ground level or the lower mid-canopy species, but they do really poorly at capturing canopy species because you just can't get that net high enough. However, point counts, they can often capture those canopy species and the more vocal species, but those more cryptic or non-vocal species can be missed. Point counts, it can also be different by habitat type. So in dense vegetation structures, such as in tropical forests, it can be more difficult to detect species with point counts. However, if we could take the data that's collected from both mistnets and the point counts and combine these two techniques, we could potentially improve estimates of detectability for each species, which would overall give us improved estimates of occupancy and allow us to derive other parameters such as species richness and diversity. So with that holy grail in mind, go to the next one. I investigated the feasibility of combining these two common bird sampling techniques. It's probably the most common ones in sampling these communities, seeing if you could combine them to improve the overall estimates of species detectability. So I used that same mistnet data that I went over before, and to this I added point counts where I had 10-minute point counts at the center of each transect where I'm just listening and watching for birds and recording everyone I see within that 10-minute period. And then those point counts were either conducted the morning of the mistnet day, which was simultaneously, or at a close by day within that visit period. And then the point counts were repeated between March 2018 and June 2019 during breeding season for 3 times total. So I had 3 different visits for point counts. So I took that data and built a detection history, which combined the species, all of the species that I detected, the different survey types, so the mistnets and point counts across all of the sites and all of those visits. So if I had a fluffy-backed tit babbler that on my first visit, I detected at this one site, and I detected it in both point counts and mistnets, then that got a 1. But if I had this little spider hunter that I only detected on point counts and did not detect on mistnets, then it was a 1-0. So I took this detection history and fit a multi-species occupancy model to it, and then used the output of that to compare the detection probability for each survey type and the detection probability if I combined the survey types. So the results of that was that the overall detection probability was actually the highest with the mistnets. Given the number of birds I caught in mistnets, I wasn't too surprised by that. The point counts were a bit lower. However, when we combined those surveys, the survey methods, both the mistnets and the point counts, we were able to really increase the overall detection probability using these 2 methods combined. So that was really exciting that was successful in increasing that detection probability. And then using the detection probability, we can then use that to look at our overall estimates of occupancy, and that should increase our estimates of occupancy across these species. And just to give you an idea of what this looks like on a by species basis, here's the detection probabilities for the most common species. So it's not all the species because that is an appendix, not a figure. This might arguably not be a figure either, but a few things that stand out is mist nets are generally much better at detecting species, but point counts for some species, they do a much better job. So for some of the canopy species or the larger species, like down here, the greater kukal, caught one greater kukal in a net. They just kind of roll out of the nets. But I detected a lot of them on point counts. So sometimes point counts are better for some species that you won't catch, and like those large-bodied birds and high canopy birds. Intuitively makes sense. Also, as a note, these habitats are really difficult to conduct point counts in, and 98% of the point counts are by ear. So you do have to be able to accurately identify all those birds. So the answer to the question is yes, we can use these multi-species occupancy models to integrate data from two very different survey types to improve our probability of detection. Moving on to the third one, using diet traits to predict species response to land use change. Now, the third and final part of my dissertation has focused on using diet traits to predict these species response to land use change. Now, we know for many species, diet is a really important predictor of whether or not a species is going to persist in an altered habitat, this new habitat. So when we change the resources available, I think I accidentally, hopefully you guys can still see that. When we change the resources available, species, they might not be able to adapt. And we see this in some studies in tropical forests and when the habitat is fragmented, you might see decreases in insectivores and frugivores. However, these directional changes are not always the same. So sometimes there have been studies that have shown insectivores don't decline in response to a disturbance and may instead increase. So part of the confusion with how a species diet influences their response to land use change may actually originate from how we define a species diet. Now, in many studies, they are just broadly grouped into diet guilds. For example, here we just have 3 diet guilds where we have frugivores and insectivores and omnivores. However, we know that birds don't fit so tightly into these categories. So insectivores will frequently eat fruit, and frugivores will occasionally supplement their diet with insects, and so it's not so tidy and straightforward. And also foraging behavior and foraging strata can influence what a bird is eating. So these broad diet guilds, they may fail to capture a lot of the variation in the diet. Now, there has been some success in using stable isotopes, specifically nitrogen isotopes, to track trophic position in birds. Basically, what happens is as you move up the trophic levels, your nitrogen isotopes increase. So for here, we have this little ant that's going to eat part of I think that's a banana plant, and your base level trophic level is the plant. But the trophic level of an ant that's feeding on the plant goes up 1 trophic level. And then the little arachnid figure that's feeding on the ant, that again goes up a trophic level. So when that bird finally eats that spider, you can sample tissue from that and determine what trophic position it's foraging at. You can get the trophic position for the bird. So we can use the stable isotopes that are sampled from bird tissue, from like claw, feathers, or blood to identify their trophic position. So that's the trophic level of their diet. But we can also get at the trophic niche width for a species. So that's sampling the trophic position of a number of individuals for each species and taking the lowest trophic position and the highest trophic position. And then you get a range of these trophic positions, the trophic levels that the birds are foraging at, which kind of gives you an idea of the breadth of their diet or the variability of their diet. And this can provide a more detailed and precise way of quantifying a bird's diet. So I wanted to see if measures of the species trophic position and its trophic niche width can predict species response better than diet yield. So with the hypothesis that trophic measures, a prediction that trophic measures would more accurately predict species response to land use change because they're essentially more precise information. So for this, I fit some generalized linear mixed models to determine what diet traits were the best predictors of species response to land use change. So for the diet guilds, I just used the categories from the Elton trait database, which is this Willman et al. Database that you can get. And a lot of different studies use the same diet categories, and they go well with the life history traits of these birds. And then I used the mean trophic position and trophic niche width taken from a study by Dave Edwards and et al. In 2015. Now, Edwards, he published a study from an old growth forest that is near SAFE. It's called Danum Valley, and it is an old growth forest that is a really similar, it's basically what the SAFE landscape would look like if no one had logged it. So it's a lowland pterocarp forest. It's got a lot of those forest specialist species. And in Edwards' study, they sampled a number of these birds in the communities and measured the stable isotopes of nitrogen to extract the mean trophic position for each species and the trophic niche width that was derived from each species. So basically you had a species and then next to it trophic position and then trophic niche width. So those are used as diet traits in my study. So it's worth noting that these diet traits, these trophic position and trophic niche width, like diet yield, these are flexible. So these might actually change with land use, but we can use it to kind of use it as an assumed trophic position and trophic niche width to predict some of those responses. So as a result of that, for the mean trophic position, I modeled that against the count of birds and found positive correlations for these logged landscapes. So you do see a positive slope with the standard error increasing a bit as you get up to the higher trophic positions. But in general, that positive correlation where the higher trophic levels or mean trophic position is correlated with more birds. And then the next one, I was kind of assuming that trophic niche width would be a really good predictor of whether a bird would persist in a disturbed landscape, because a wide trophic niche width basically is an indicator that they have a pretty broad diet. So you would assume that they would be able to adapt better. But what you find here is it's not as strong of a correlation as the trophic position, mean trophic position. You do see some positive correlation, so positive slope with these this blue, so the salvage logged forest and the oil palm forest fragments, and a little bit in the oil palm plantation, but no positive slope with the selective logged forest fragments. Now, when I looked at all of those different diet trait predictors in the models, and I compared these models. So I had models that looked at trophic position, models that looked at the niche range, and then at diet yield. And I used AIC to compare these models and pick that top model. And overall, the model, the overall best model included the mean trophic position. So mean trophic position was the best predictor for this community response. So the top predictor was trophic position, and then that was followed by the trophic niche width. However, diet yield is actually a poor predictor in comparison. So with this, we find that diet traits with more precise information did turn out to be better predictors. However, that's not where it stops. This is kind of like the intro, the beginning of a much bigger project, and very excited to see where this goes in the future. My collaborator at the University of Hong Kong, Dr. Caroline Dingle, and students, they have all my samples from Borneo, and we are going to run stable isotope analysis. We're actually running it now on the nitrogen and carbon isotopes, and we're going to look at how trophic structure changes with land use. So we can really see actually how flexible those traits are and what really happens. Especially interested in the carbon because there's differences in the C4 and C3 carbon with the grasses and the trees. So very excited about that. It's been a bit delayed with the whole Hong Kong protests and the pandemic, but it's slow and steady. So hopefully you will see all of that sometime in the future in publication. So just to kind of summarize, you see that land use has significant impacts on bird communities. And we see differences in those impacts when we look at logging versus oil palm, where logging might have been a relatively intense form of land use. A lot of trees were taken out, but oil palm, even with those oil palm forest fragments, it was still a much lower diversity and even abundance in those areas. And then landscape context matters. And this is kind of when we look at the interpreting patterns of beta diversity, where you have these areas that are surrounded by the salvage logged forests, which is different, but not as different as the oil palm, and these forest fragments that are surrounded by oil palm. When we look at those patterns of beta diversity, you see changes in nestedness versus turnover. And that can provide insight to, are we losing species or new species moving in, and how are those communities changing? And then we see that we can use these multi-species occupancy models to optimize our species detections, which can really improve our understanding of how species are responding to these land uses. And then finally, we can use these more precise measures of diet, like from the stable isotope data, trophic position and trophic niche width, that can provide insight into species responses to this land use change. So what are the implications? We know oil palm landscapes are expanding all over, and they're driving a lot of deforestation. But there's also some room to think about the futures of designing these oil palm landscapes for sustainability and optimizing biodiversity. So when you have these oil palm forest fragments, what I was showing you wasn't looking that great, but it's worth thinking of ways to potentially improve connectivity, like riparian buffers or more fragments, etc. And then also, there's still a lot of value in these logged landscapes. One of the pitfalls that we want to avoid is, land managers might see those logged landscapes and think, well, they're terrible biodiversity anyway, we might as well clear them and plant oil palm. But we show those logged landscapes still hold a decent amount of diversity. Not as great as old growth forests, but they do still have that diversity. And then finally, I didn't specifically examine old growth forests, mostly because of logistical and time reasons, but these logged areas are still no replacements for these old growth forests. So we still missed a lot of this forest specialist that you would only find in old growth forests. So that's something to keep in mind. And with that, I would like to thank a lot of people. I think I have a few minutes to do that, or 1 minute to do that, but my committee, Rob Fletcher, has been essential in his support in helping me think up all this stuff, especially with the multi-species occupancy modeling. And then my committee has just been great at their support and helping me with my work and making sure it's up to par. And then in Malaysia, Dr. Kalsum Yusa was my local collaborator, and she was very important in being able to conduct the work there, and then different support staff at SAFE as well. Field assistance, like Rob said, this is incredibly difficult field work, and I had the best field assistants. There were zero complaints, positive attitude, and they were just great, but they made all of this data possible. And then in general, Simona Picardi and Ellen Robertson have been great for stats help and just general emotional support for everyone else. And then the Fletcher Lab for always giving me feedback on ideas. There's been a number of organizations in Borneo that help with access, permitting, and fieldwork support. It's been very critical to making this project take off. And then for funding and support was the UF SNRE and the UF Biodiversity Institute Fellowship, which actually funded me for a year and made all of this continuing possible. And then I got a number of small grants that helped me fund my field work in the field from including TCD, the AOS, and Explorers Club. So thank you to all of those people, those organizations. Couldn't have done it without any of those people. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Yay, awesome job, Jessica. Thank you so much for that presentation. And what a treat to see those amazing bird pictures. I can't even imagine what it's like to witness those species in person. So we do have—
I do think Borneo has some of the best.
Yeah, it's so unique. We have a few minutes, so please feel free, if you are in the Zoom meeting, this is your time to ask questions. You can unmute your mic, or you can type in the chat, and on YouTube you can type in the chat as well. So go ahead.
Jess, I have a question. Sorry about the echo there. Really awesome stuff, super interesting, and particularly just in mind looking at the role of secondary integrated forests. I'm wondering either whether you explored anecdotally or in your occupancy models, the persistence of birds in oil palm, as well as some of the degraded forest landscapes. Do you think a lot of the species there, were you finding them in your mist nets or point counts because they were dispersing through, or was temporary occupancy versus permanent occupancy? So anecdotally, what do you think?
That is a great question. And I actually do have the data to kind of get at that. I haven't included that specifically in this analysis, but because I had repeated visits, I banded all of these birds and I got recaptures. So I know for a lot of these species that they are maintaining territories here. And so they are residents, that's their occupancy as residents. However, one of the things that I think is really interesting, and when you compare it to studies of other oil palm plantations that have, just they don't have that close by huge forest, they're like safe, and they don't have these fragments. In the oil palm sites I had, we actually got a few species like the chestnut cap thrush and black cap babbler, and some of these forest specialists. It wasn't that many, but it was a couple where we caught them in nets. And I suspect, and we got some woodpeckers too. I'm almost positive that those birds were just moving through the matrix. Now the difficulty, it's kind of the target effect with these smaller fragments. It's a big area for birds to have to find these fragments. And so they might be willing to move through that matrix, but whether or not they will actually encounter this fragment is another question. And one of the things that is really distinct about these fragments is the cicadas are just going crazy in them. So they're super loud, and they pretty much drown out. These were really difficult areas to do point counts in because the cicadas just drown out all of the bird call, a lot of the bird song. So I wouldn't be surprised if, these birds can't even detect a fragment because they're missing a lot of the cues that they would normally have. So, but yeah, I do think birds are actually moving through it, probably more so than they would move through, like an open area pasture, because the oil palm does provide some cover.
Other questions? I have a question for you as well, Jess, and that is for the second study you were talking about. I'm just curious if it's common for researchers to use multiple methods of species detection techniques, or were you like into a new frontier there when you were testing that?
So it is actually common for researchers when they're sampling a community to use multiple different survey techniques, because one of them might pick up part of the community that another doesn't. So I talked about bird communities, but in mammal communities, you might have traps on the ground versus camera traps in the treetops that are capturing different parts of the communities. So I think that is one of the frustrations with a lot of ornithologists and probably other researchers, is that we recognize the limitations of each of these survey techniques, but having a way to combine it like this has been missing. And it's just been in the last few years that these models have started to be developed that will allow this combination in this way. Because before, you took the MistNet data and you analyzed it, and then you took the point count data and you analyzed it, and then you compared the different results. But I would love to see this. Basically, we'll see what Rob has to say. I would love to see this as a thing for almost like a how-to for bird researchers. Like, if I can use it on my stuff, you guys can use it on your stuff. And then it just, for people who are doing both MistNets and point counts, just a standard method for how to combine that data.
Thank you for clarifying that. Do we have any other questions? It looks like Dave, maybe you have another one.
I have another one if no one else does. Jess, you had a lot of beautiful photos of these birds, and I don't know if it was just the ones that you chose to represent the different systems, but it did seem with one of your slides where you had the 4 different types of modified systems, the oil palm had much more drab birds than the ones within the secondary forest. Was that because, you got to show the really beautiful birds, or do you think there was some type of filtering of coloration? It would be a really cool direction to pursue.
Yeah, that is a really interesting question. And yeah, oil palm definitely has a lot of really drab birds. I'm not sure if it's just the fact that if you looked at the proportion of drab birds to colorful birds in forests, if that proportion is maintained in oil palm or not, but that would certainly be something interesting to explore. I think there is a trend towards oil palm on body size, a reduction in overall body size that you see. There are certainly a few larger birds that weren't captured, but generally it's a fairly small body size. But things like that, it would be interesting to consider for oil palm. I will just highlight that sometimes you do catch pretty birds in oil palm, like this blue-crowned hanging parrot. And this is an interesting instance where there's some habitat supplementation going on here. So these birds don't live in oil palm. These parrots don't live in oil palm. They nest in the forest fragments, and then they fly into oil palm, and they will actually eat the palm fruit itself. So I would watch them fly back and forth in between the forest fragment and out into the oil palm plantations.
Jess, I have a related question, because you just mentioned like anecdotally that you saw smaller body sizes in certain sites versus others. So when you were looking at the diet traits and the responses to land use change, did you consider, or would you be interested in considering, like any other traits besides diet?
Oh, definitely. This is such an interesting area to get into, looking at species traits and how it can predict species responses. And there's like a list of things that I would love to look at. And I think one of the things that could potentially be super interesting is related to that difference of, where you see nestedness versus turnover, and tying some traits to that, to where if we know in these fragments, we assume that there's some species nestedness, potentially due to the isolation of that fragment and some dispersal constraints of species. So I've seen other work where people have looked at specific traits and used that to say, yeah, we've got forest specialists in these areas, and then generalists in these other areas. So you're getting species replacement here, or the different dispersal traits where you're seeing some of this nestedness due to these different dispersal traits. Some of the difficulty with that is there's not a lot of dispersal movement information on some of these species, although there was a recent paper that showed some promising data on that. So it's definitely an area that I would be super interested in exploring. So yeah, if you are looking for a PhD project, there's some potential with Borneo birds.
All right, well, I think that's all the time that we have for today, but thank you guys for your great questions, and thank you, Jessica, for an awesome presentation. We will see you guys next week with our next graduate seminar. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.